And just like that, Washington Mutual's shareholders were wiped out. That's not to say the Washington Mutual executives didn't play their part and leave themselves vulnerable to a financial predator. However, regardless of the free pass JP Morgan has been given in the past by the mainstream press, some stories are now beginning to trickle out showing that JP Morgan played a role in the demise of Lehman Brothers as well as other corporations, some of which JP Morgan then swooped in and purchased at bargain basement prices. Unfortunately, in the case of Washington Mutual, we have what appears to be collusion between JP Morgan, the FDIC, and the Federal Reserve. The Seattle Times reports last spring JP Morgan offered up $8 a share for WaMu, with the final price depending on how its loans performed. Instead, WaMu sold a partial stake to TPG. When WaMu was seized by the federal regulator September 25th, most of its banking operations were sold to JP Morgan for $1.9 billion, and the company's stock was rendered worthless. Killinger called Paulson in July to ask the Treasury Secretary to use his influence with the Securities and Exchange Commission to add WaMu to a list of 19 financial institutions that were temporarily protected from a form of trading called naked short selling that can drive share prices artificially low. Paulson refused to help Killinger get WaMu on the list. The Financial Times reports that as of September 18th, 5 banks had come forward to evaluate Washington Mutual's financial records as part of an auction process run by WaMu's advisor. The New York Times reports that while WaMu was trying to sell itself, the government then stepped up its efforts, at points going behind WaMu's back to work privately with 4 potential bidders on a deal. It also states that WaMu couldn't find anyone to make the numbers work while deadlines passed without anyone submitting a bid, and of course this was because they knew they would be able to get a better deal from the government than they could from Washington Mutual. So on September 25th, 2008, on its 119th birthday, coincidentally enough, Washington Mutual was seized and sold within hours to JP Morgan for a paltry $1.9 billion. The seizure took place on a Thursday, which is unheard of. Bank seizures take place on Fridays, which gives the outgoing entity time to get its books in order and figure out what happened. In the case of Washington Mutual, they were just told to get out. For liquidity purposes, Washington Mutual's holding company had lent its banks over $4 billion. $4 billion, which JP Morgan then claimed Washington Mutual had to prove was theirs. And once JP Morgan gave it up, the FDIC then stepped in and stated they wanted control of the $4.4 billion. The FDIC's website states that the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation preserves and promotes public confidence in the U.S. financial system by insuring deposits in banks and thrift institutions. No place does it state the FDIC may own its own private banks. Yet when JP Morgan wanted no part of Washington Mutual's New York City-based banks, the FDIC assumed control and is now in the banking industry. This is clearly a conflict of interests, since the FDIC played a huge role in having Washington Mutual's credit ratings slashed. It cut Washington Mutual off from being able to borrow money from the Federal Reserve. Without help from the Federal Reserve, Washington Mutual was forced into seizure by the FDIC. So the same entity that effectively cut off Washington Mutual from any means of salvation then capitalized on Washington Mutual's failure. This from a corporation that claims to be an independent agency of the federal government. It should also be noted that Washington Mutual was seized on September 25th, just 4 days before the Emergency Economic Stabilization Act of 2008 was signed into being. The Seattle Times reports tax rule might have helped WaMu. Washington Mutual might have been acquired rather than seized by regulators if a recent tax rule change had come a few days earlier, financial industry experts say. I suppose then we could assume that had Washington Mutual survived just a few more days, JP Morgan would have been able to purchase all of its branches for $1.9 billion, And the FDIC wouldn't own former WaMu branches in New York City. And while Washington Mutual shareholders wait with bated breath to find out the outcome of the $4.4 billion, the FDIC states that the money could be used to repay creditors of the bankrupt parent company, as well as the FDIC if needed. Yet the FDIC has stated time and time again they did not front one penny in the seizure and sale of Washington Mutual. As the U.S. government rushes headfirst into its New World Order goal of socialized fascism and a one-world economy, several pro-WaMu activist groups have popped up, and all they want are answers. You can help by visiting their websites and by sharing this information with others. Because if we don't speak up now, we may never have the opportunity to do so again. It could be your job, your savings, or your life wiped out next.